Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes for people to log in and get set. While you're coming in, though, you'll notice the chat feature, and we want to invite you to pop your name and where you're calling in from into the chat feature. It's fun for us to kind of see where in the world you are and where you're calling in from. So we'll wait just a couple moments here, and but get acquainted with that chat feature. Hi, Melissa from Minneapolis, just like Melissa did. Greg from Seattle. Hi, good to have you guys. Hey, Jake. All right. Yeah, utilize that chat feature for those of you who are just coming in, and you'll see other people populating that with their names and where they're calling in from. It's a great picture of a community of people who are wanting to do better. And so welcome. The comment space for us, the chat thread is a space for us to interact with one another. And so as things come up for you throughout this webinar, if there's a compelling quote or an idea, a resource that you're acquainted with, go ahead and throw it in there, because we want to see and we want to have some cross-pollinated learning. So go ahead and do that. Welcome to another Global Immersion webinar. This one is called Dear White Peacemakers, and we're utilizing the language that our friend Osheta has created because this is a unique moment in time for white peacemakers to figure out what it means to come to the restorative table together. And so today's conversation is in honor of George Floyd, who was yesterday Minneapolis police officers. We lament and we're outraged by it. And so the circumstance for this particular conversation is sadly, again, fresh, and it's in the wake of a countless number of Black lives that has been prematurely extinguished by whiteness. It was another lynching that happened yesterday, and it was wrong. And we lament, and this conversation is in honor and memory of George. We're also mindful of a video that surfaced yesterday of a white woman, and it was a classic example of how whiteness weaponizes whiteness at the expense of people of color, as Amy Cooper called the police on Christian Cooper. And as we were watching that video, we were thinking about what Andre Henry said just a couple weeks ago when he let us know that Black folk are 5 times more likely to being assaulted by police officers than white folk. And so when we weaponize whiteness because of fear and prejudice, we're actually taking into our own hands potentially the future and the outcome of our relatives of color. And so we're mindful, we're holding space as well for what happened in Central Park, and are mindful of Christian Cooper and the trauma that he experienced in that space. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. It is necessary, it is essential, it is urgent, and it's too late. We have a problem to fix, and we as white folk, we have a role to play in it. If you don't identify as white, welcome to this conversation as well, and we hope that this is a moment where your hope grows that work is being done among the white community as it pertains to anti-racism. My name is Jer Swigert. I'm the co-founder of Global Immersion. We're a peacemaking training organization that forms people of faith to engage our divided world in restorative ways. That means that we spend our lives training people of faith to see themselves, God, others, and the world more accurately. We want to learn how to see the pain and the plight in the world, as well as our own contributions to it. We train people to immerse into the radical center of the pain. That means that we have to take a step off the roads of comfort and into reality, equipped not with tools to win, but with curiosity and compassion, the tools to transform. We train everyday peacemakers who contend not by getting even, but by getting creative in love. And we believe that as we become people who learn to see, immerse, and contend, restoration begins to spring to life all around us. We actually find ourselves as a part of the restorative revolution that's well underway. In our webinars, we examine current events through the lenses of everyday peacemaking in order to become substantively different kinds of people. So again, that means that our webinars are not moments simply based in education, they're based in transformation. We should become different kinds of people in lieu of the conversation that we're about to have. This is a third conversation in a row that's interacting with whiteness. And we're doing this as a Global Immersion Project in an effort to further awaken us to the realities of race, whiteness, racism, and anti-racism. Number two, to build our agency as anti-racists, and number three, to equip us to intervene on racialized oppression as everyday peacemakers. 2 weeks ago, we facilitated a conversation with Andre Henry, and it was a riveting conversation in which we got to actually define some terms. We defined what race and what whiteness and what racism and anti-racism are. I'm not going to go over those definitions. Again, I want to urge you to go to our archive and listen in on that conversation. It was an essential one. But we also lamented the tragic lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, and Andre considered Ahmaud's death through the lenses of history. And so it was an unbelievable experience to look at this moment and then to trace the lines all the way back to the roots of this. When did this begin? And it helped us understand Ahmaud's passing in I think, a much more vivid and HD kind of way. Andre offered a call to action. He said, we have to do our own work, especially as the white community. We have to do our own work, no longer at the expense of people of color. Number two, we must learn what it means to become informed by leaders of color, how to follow their lead, what it means to have them as mentors in our lives. Number three, we better get organized. We better learn what it means to get organized as the white community. And number four, we have to figure out how to participate in nonviolent interventions. And so that was 2 weeks ago. Last week, we facilitated a conversation with 3 white people who were a part of that first webinar with Andre, just in an effort to do kind of some real-time processing. How do we as white folk take in the gift of a conversation like we had with Andre and allow it to actually transform who it is that we're becoming? And so we offered a 4-question grid for how we engage in conversations like these. Number one, what did you learn that you didn't know before? Number two, when and where in the conversation were you exposed? Question 3, how were you challenged? And question 4, what is the action that you're taking? Now that action is with regard to formation, education, influence, and activism. And so again, those questions: what did you learn? When and where were you exposed? How were you challenged? And what action did you take? I want to invite us to consider this conversation through the lenses of those 4 questions. Again, this week's webinar is in conversation with the previous 2 weeks, but especially in light of the killing of George Floyd yesterday, this conversation with Osheta Moore will very much so stand alone.
Thanks, Jer. Good to see you all jumping in from around the globe. My name is John Huckins. I'm the other co-founding director of Global Immersion. And where are we going today? Jared gave us a recap of where we've been the last few weeks. And as many of you know who've interacted with our work, whether it's on an immersion trip or webinars or whatever it might be, our starting point is through the lens and the understanding that God's mission is restoration, that God is healing all things, and we are participants in that. That's our invitation as peacemakers. And so many of us, when it comes to realities like racism, which are a reality that some have denied for so long and are just now waking up to the fact that it has been baked into our bones, but we're sitting on this call and we are paralyzed and we don't know where to start. We don't know what to say without feeling like we say the wrong thing. Maybe you've had your fingers pointed at you and you feel a sense of shame. But you know that the silence actually is complicity, but you're unaware of what the alternative is. If I am not silent, what does it mean to speak up? And so we want to acknowledge that some of you probably are in that space. And if you feel paralyzed, you're not alone. And we're grateful you're on the journey. Others of us maybe have been interrogating where racism has actually informed who we are and how we see the world for our whole lives. And as we've woken up to that and confronted that brokenness in ourselves, we have reacted and respond in such a way that we begin to point fingers back at the communities that we've left and shamed them because they're not as far along on the journey as we are. Mm-hmm. In our effort to become allies of those impacted by racism, we've actually widened the divides with the very communities we actually are called to walk with and see healed and transformed, such that we can participate in a bigger vision of restoration that we trust that God is making real. This is the language of beloved community, that the table at the end of this journey is going to involve, has to involve all of us to participate in a community that transcends our borders and our boundaries. And so if you're in that space and you've realized you've actually burned more bridges than mended divides, you have a seat at this table as well. And that's why we actually are so grateful to sit alongside, to learn from, to walk with someone like Osheta, who has committed her life to walking with white people like us towards that beloved community, towards that table, that restored table that we all have a seat at, but we're not exactly sure what the journey to that table looks like. Mm-hmm. And so let's move to that table. Let's have that be our common vision, not just getting smarter, but actually becoming more whole, participating in what God has already begun, allowing that to inform who we are and how we interact with our communities. So this is really a peacemaking training that Osheta is going to guide us into, focused for us as white folks to be part of that big vision of restoration, to get us prepared for that conversation, because this journey is not an easy one. And oftentimes we deviate all over the place. We need some centering. And so I want to invite our colleague, Haley Mitsui, to come in to bring us to a space of centering before we hear from Osheta.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we're just going to take a moment to ground ourselves as we enter into this conversation. And our team actually had an extensive conversation about the best way to do this. And we want to do a breath prayer, knowing that breath is a very tender and vulnerable word and action at this moment, as we know how the breath has been taken away from so many of our Black brothers and sisters. But for those of us that are not Black, acknowledging our breath can actually be a profound act of solidarity. And so I'd ask everyone to close your eyes here or soften your gaze and start to become aware of your breath. This rhythm, this sacred energy that keeps us alive. And on your inhale, you're going to inhale whatever name for God you feel most close to in this moment. Might be God, Lord, Jesus, mystery, creator. What name for God resonates with you in this moment? And breathe in that name. And breathe out, have mercy.
Have mercy.
And breathe in the name of God. And breathe out, have mercy. And let's do that a few more times in silence together. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Haley. For those of you who have joined us in the last couple of moments, we're here with Osheta Moore, and she is a Minneapolis-based pastor, peacemaker, and author. And in light of what just happened yesterday in Minneapolis with George Floyd, we're humbled to be in conversation with you, Osheta. Also recognizing you're coming in real as always and raw for in light of what happened yesterday. And so let's just begin with who are you? For those of you who may not be familiar with you, who are you and how are you today?
Hey, Jer and John and Haley, thanks for having me. Okay, so my name's Osheta Moore, and I am a pastor in the Twin Cities. We live in St. Paul, and I am also an author. So I wrote a book called Shalom Sisters, which was all about me trying to figure out what to do with that Hebraic concept of shalom when my husband and I met, so I'm married and I have 3 teenagers, so y'all can pray for me. And when my husband and I met, we met doing urban core development work in the urban core of New Orleans, in a neighborhood known for its gang violence and low performing schools. And we were there until Hurricane Katrina happened. And then we evacuated. And when we evacuated, we went to Boston for him to go to seminary. And all of my like formation as a leader in that context was taught me that peacemaking and shalom seeking was really tied to these really big and sensational acts of peacemaking. Like, we literally had gang members at our kitchen table in New Orleans where we were like, you have to leave your guns at the door. Like, you cannot bring your guns in our house, and we have to talk through some things. But then I moved to Boston, and I was 8 months pregnant with our second. And then after we had our second, we found out we were pregnant with our third shortly after that. And so my life just became a very ordinary, everyday life. And yet I deeply believe that Jesus doesn't stop being my Prince of Peace just at Christmas time. Like, Jesus is my Prince of Peace, the peace of the kingdom of God. It is a huge value for me, and I want to seek that and create that. And just because I don't have these big, extravagant ways of doing it, I had to figure out how to work through that. And so Shalom Sisters was all about me learning how to be an everyday peacemaker, right in my ordinary life, and knowing that what I have and who I am, the person that God made me, is a gift to my community, and I can use that to be an agent of shalom. And I really found a whole lot of hope and encouragement. And Brueggemann's description of shalom is multi-directional, multi-dimensional, because for me, that just flew open the doors or the floodgates of all the opportunities and all the ways that I can partner with God in creating peace. And it doesn't always have to look like working with gang members, or working, in a low-income school, or going overseas and being a human shield, or getting a degree in, peacemaking or conflict management or de-escalation. Like, I could be a part of God remaking the world and creating shalom. And so for me, that has been just the grounding of my ministry and my leadership, is figuring out like how to help people in their ordinary everyday lives be peacemakers. But then my work kind of turned as a Black woman. If I was writing this book, and I was realizing I can't say that I'm seeking shalom with God, because I think of shalom multi-directional between me and God, within myself, with others, in my context, and then systems of the world. Mm-hmm. And I realized I couldn't seek shalom with God unless I was very comfortable in this brown body. And as I became really comfortable with my body and who God made me to be, I recognized that there was so much brokenness in the world that is constantly telling me there's something wrong with this body. And white supremacy and racism became a part of my language and my mission of dismantling, because that's a space where we see a great need for shalom. And so I wrote the book, and then I moved to the Twin Cities. My husband's a pastor as well, so we went to seminary for him. We moved to LA for him to be a pastor there for a little bit, an associate pastor. Then he took a lead pastor job here in St. Paul. And he leads a small church around like 50 or 60. And then I am teaching an outreach pastor at Woodland Hills, which is a larger congregation. Neo-Anabaptist. So nonviolence and peacemaking, that for me is the only way that I can truly embody the teachings of Jesus, which is a huge value for Anabaptists. So that's who I am. Now, how am I? I am having a hard time, to be honest, because I am just so tired. I'm so tired of this. And I was talking to a friend earlier today, and she was like, I was just starting to put Ahmaud Arbery in my rearview mirror, and now we have something else in front of us. And I'm like, that is how it is. And so right now I'm really excited to have this conversation, because I feel like this is probably like as real and as honest and as like in the weeds as you're going to get from me, then but peacemaking and encouraging white people to be peacemakers in a situation like this you'll probably ever get. So I'm nervous, but I'm really grateful.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And that's one of the great gifts, that Jared and I are so aware of, that you don't owe any of us this content, this message, your time, especially in this moment, understanding all that is going on. not only in our country or in Minneapolis, but what's going on in you.
Yeah.
But you feel called and compelled to walk with people like us. And we are grateful for that. And we want to name that. And we understand why many other leaders of color are saying, hey, this is your time to do your own work, white folks. And that makes a lot of sense. And also you're someone who's saying, hey, I'll walk with you in that. And we are deeply grateful. So like the Dear White Peacemakers language is not our language. That's your language. And that was birthed in, as far as I understand, a podcast, and now is being put in book form, which we are thrilled as that comes out next year. We'll make sure in our follow-up to be sending more about that. But would you share a little bit about where this language came from and what the message is?
Yeah. So for me, I feel very passionate about equipping people to be peacemakers by saying, like, you're a peacemaker, like right where you are, like you have the capacity to be a peacemaker, right? But the language of Dear White Peacemaker kind of just slowly built from, there was one sort of, as Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil says, a catalytic event. There was one catalytic event that really crystallized, like, what exactly do I want to say to white people who are in the middle of this conversation, who are just now starting to understand that race is an issue in our country? They're disturbed by it. They want to be mobilized by it, but they don't quite know like what the next steps are. That started for me in LA when my oldest son, who's 17 now, he was 14 then at that point, he was called the N-word by a coach during like recess time or gym or something. And it was one of those moments where my son was being just being a kid. And I think this always happens. Like Black people are just being ourselves, and he was just being a kid, and he was just kind of being goofy. And like him and his friends were teasing each other, and the white coach yelled like, "Hey, so-and-so, stop it," like the white kid. And then he turned to the other coach and said, "Leave it up to the N-word to start trouble." And the other kid was a white kid. And so my son, that whole process really exposed some racism going on at that school, because what happened immediately was we've taught our son how to approach situations where he has been called the N-word or like a racially charged situation. Like we've helped him learn to be an advocate for himself. And so he immediately like went to the school office, reported the principal or reported the coach. My son was brought in without my husband and I into 2 meetings with the coach and the principal, where the coach was kind of telling him like, "You didn't really hear me say that. Like I took a Black woman to prom. There's no way I would ever have said that." Like just gaslighting my son. And then it finally got back to me, and I was so furious. And we had a meeting planned, and I was laying in bed that night, and I was like in the thick of writing this book. And I was on my chapter about telling better stories about our enemies and the people. And I say our enemy is the person who is just right outside of our empathy. That like the person for whom I would say, I would never say that, or I would never do that. That is my enemy. And so I was laying in bed, and I was like, okay, Jesus, you are asking me to love my enemy, and this coach is like straight right outside of my empathy. Like he has truly hurt my son, and I just want to go in there guns blazing. And I started praying and asking God to help me tell a better story about this coach, to help me humanize this coach, to go into this meeting and ask, and with a posture of what happened, what went wrong. Like obviously something went wrong, and what's your perspective, and how can we fix this? You did something wrong. How do we fix this? And going into that meeting, it's less of like on the defense, but more as an invitation, and say, I really don't want you to say something like this to another kid. I really want you to understand your blind spots around this. I don't think you meant to hurt my son. And I just really spent that whole night while I was trying to fall asleep praying for God to help me have that posture. And I did go into that meeting, and I do feel like I was very invitational to that coach, and he was resistant still, and he was dogmatic that he didn't do anything wrong. But what I realized that was in me, things changed in me, because up to that moment when I would think about race and racial reconciliation, it was very much white people, you need to get your stuff together because Black people have been so wronged. but that never really felt really loving to me. But going into that meeting, I felt like I did my very best to love this person. And I hope that the next time he engages with somebody around a conversation around race, he doesn't have that memory of being told he's the worst, but me saying like, hey, what happened with you? I literally said in that meeting, like, what happened in your mind that you would think that word about my son? Like, what happened? And so that for me kind of built this, it had me asking God this question of what would it look like to have an invitational approach to the racial reconciliation conversation that invited white people in, saying, listen, here's the deal. Oppression affects the oppressor and the oppressed. Broken systems affect all people, and there's a brokenness that all of us experience. And while my specific brokenness looks like my son gets called the N-word at school, I'm followed when I am in the grocery store, men that look like my father and brother are choked on the street, or shot down while they're running, and that's how this broken system affects me. But this broken system affects white people too. There's a defensiveness, there's a shame, there's a guilt, there's a lack of empathy or humility. Like the system affects white people too. And I wanted to, and for me, the best way to be a peacemaker towards them was to approach them with a posture of peace and say, we're both broken, and how do we work together towards wholeness? And so for me, so that was the beginning of that. And then the language really did crystallize when I was just writing an Instagram post after I went to an event that really frustrated me. That it was a white-led organization, and they used hymn from the civil rights movement as their kind of like guiding song, and they named a whole gala after it, and never once did they mention the writer or its implications for the African American community or its influence in the civil rights movement, or none of that. And I wrote an Instagram post, and I was thinking, what is the very best way for me to communicate to white people who are trying to figure this out, who are like, okay, I know that something feels a little off about maybe the song being a part of this organization, but why? I asked myself, what is the best way to approach them or invite them into the conversation? What felt like more of an invitation than me, like a more calling in and less calling out. And so for me, dear white peacemakers, like the dear part means like you and I are equally beloved, and you and I are made in God's image, and I desire to be in relationship with you. So that's why I start like dear white peacemakers. So white is, I really want white people to understand their social location. Like social location is who are you and where are you, and how do you as a white man relate to the world, or how do you as a white woman relate to the world, and what are the privileges and what are the benefits, and what are the ways that you kind of move through this world in that body, in that social location. I move through the world with a certain social location, and there are different implications for that. So white people, I want you to understand your social location. And then the other thing is, I deeply believe Ephesians 6, where we are encouraged that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Because when I was having that posture of who is my enemy, I really wanted that coach to be my enemy. But the reality is, like, humans are never our enemies. And so if I can call out a system saying the white supremacy and whiteness is a broken and evil system that we are all influenced by, that is something that you as a white person and me as a Black person can rally against, and we wrestle with that and not each other. Then the peacemakers is, I want us to work together to make peace, to work to be conscious of how do we create that essential it is goodness of the garden right where we are. Because when God created this world with goodness and flourishing and vibrancy and dignity and relationships. And peacemaking together looks like, how do we get back to that essential it is goodness? How do we create that together? And then also peacemaking looks like, we have a different way of modeling and working through race and racial reconciliation together in such a way that it is noticeable by others, because scripture says they will know you are Christians by your love, which is like a VBS song that we sing and we forget about it. But really, there's something so incredibly attractive about people working together and learning to live with each other in love and believing the best about each other and moving forward against those powers and principalities, that just really gave me a deeper, bolder vision than just the simple race is a problem, white people, you need to get your stuff together. And I will be back here while you figure your stuff out, and I'm going to call you out when you're doing something wrong. But I really wanted to be like, how do I walk alongside you? So I know some anti-racism educators would say, like, it's not my job to teach you. Or some might say, like, I'm not your priest, I'm not your pastor. But my posture is, I'm happy to walk alongside you. As much as it's healthy for me, I do believe in healthy boundaries, and I can talk about that later. But also, like, I'm happy to be like your anti-racism spiritual director. Like, I'm happy to just sit and listen and process with you, because what I care about is you understanding who you are and your unique capacity to create peace around this issue.
Mm-hmm. My arms are shaking. I'm just like, come on. I love the vision for peace and for peacemaking that you offer, and the invitational ethos of your message, Osheta, is unbelievable, and it's gracious, and it's generous, truly generous. One of the things I want to raise up before we move on to the conversation, though, is the distinction that you make between white people and whiteness. Mm-hmm. And I want you to lift that to the surface a little bit more. I think Andre helped us a couple of weeks ago talking about whiteness, not from a biological point of view, but when you talk about it in the realm of powers and principalities, it's a thing that we can actually link arms and take on together. So talk a little bit more about why the distinction between whiteness and white people is actually so important in the message that you're actually, that you embody and are leaning into with us.
Yeah. So here's the deal. You as a white person, your shame and your white guilt doesn't help. It does not move the dial forward at all. It does not create shalom. It doesn't create shalom within yourself, and it definitely doesn't create shalom or peace between you and me. And what I feel like is when we conflate the system of whiteness or the system of white supremacy, or we attach all of our hatred and anger and frustration with that system, when we attach it to people, that causes our white brothers and sisters to have to navigate a tremendous amount of shame and a tremendous amount of guilt. And it creates a foothold, like scripture says, for the enemy of bitterness and resentment. And they don't have the stamina. You don't have the stamina to continue doing this work, because if the only narrative that you get is that because you're a white person, there's something intrinsically wrong with you because of something that happened, that because of the fallout of white supremacy, then you're no help to me. Because if you don't believe that you have a unique calling and a unique capacity in doing this work because of shame, then you're taken out of this work. And I need white people to know where they are and who they are called to be, and to step into that. So the importance for me is saying whiteness is this structure. Whiteness is this thing. It is fueled by white supremacy. And so how do we have a conversation about that? But then you are a person who happens to be white, or you are a person who God made to be white. And God didn't make a mistake in making you white, Jer. God didn't make a mistake in making you white, John. Like, nobody white on this call, God was like, oops, I meant to make them something else. Like, you are white, and God did not make a mistake in that. You happen to be a white person in a social location, in a world that gives you certain benefits and says that you don't have to really worry about race. And so what the distinction for me is, I need you to know that there's nothing wrong with you being a white person. And I need you to know that you are beloved in your white skin. This is one of the reasons why I really love Dr. King's vision for the beloved community that is built on nonviolence, that we are not going to have nonviolent word or thoughts Words are thoughts towards each other. And if I think there's something wrong with you because you're white, that's me having a violent thought and posture towards you. And I also need you to know you're beloved. I need you to feel comfortable in your white skin just as much as I need to feel comfortable in my brown skin, so that we can honor the Imago Dei in each other, dignify each other, and resist all of those forces that are constantly taking the lives of brown and black people and violating their image, their Imago Dei. And so that distinction is so important for me, because if I don't have the trust of a white person to say, I believe that you are good in your white skin, and I believe that you are beloved in your white skin, but because you're white, there are all these things I need you to be aware of, and I need you to rise up as a peacemaker. I feel like that's a more empowering way and a more invitational way, again. Because I don't have time, honestly, real talk, I don't have time to sit and wade through a whole lot of shame and guilt. I need for us to own our belovedness.
That is such a good word. And I just, as I'm imagining so many of us on this call hearing this and paying attention to ways that maybe we have experienced this economy of shame. And I think, Osheta, that is like the shame is like the antithesis of our identity as God's beloved, right? It's saying that we have to, we are not enough as we are. And it allows us, when we confront that, like, it liberates us to deal with constructs of whiteness, to see the systems and the systems and constructs that we've inherited, not as a threat, but just as an awakening in us. But I think a lot of us hear words like white or whiteness, and we're so triggered by shame that we're paralyzed. Or we've been in that economy of shame so long that we just point at people. Once we think we've figured it out, we point at people and cast on that same economy of shame that is really a reflection of our own unprocessed pain. And that's why I think what I'm hearing you say, and this is such common language in how we talk about peacemaking, is it's a formational journey. Like, what I'm hearing you say is, guys, this is a discipleship pathway. Understand your identity as God's beloved. That liberates you to confront the powers and principalities of whiteness, and then do your own work to invite people into something more whole. Which one of my questions is, and I see this coming up in the thread, when your starting point is belovedness, beloved community, whiteness as a construct, not a critique of who you are as a white person, how do you notice the posture shift in your audience when you talk about these hard issues? Do you see a distinction in how people receive the message? And if so, what do we have to learn from that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so one of the things that my husband and I learned in in therapy, was that we were having a lot of internal conflict. And one of the things that the therapist said was, like, you guys need to recognize that you have an enormous amount of external conflict, like things that are pressing into you that is causing internal conflict. And so if you can take the pressure off of each other and see the best of each other and recognize it's kind of you against these external things. Like, we had like financial things and we had little ones, and there's just so much kind of like a lot of things that we were processing and kind of like figuring out what to deal with. And when she said that, it really, my husband and I really like had this shift in our marriage where we were like, oh, we're on the same team. Like it's not your way and my way is better, because we're so different personality types. My husband's white, and so there's that dynamic in there too. But when we were like, oh, okay, like it's us against the world, almost like it's us and all these external things, then we were able to say, okay, let's look at this external thing. What is the problem with that? How do you approach it? How do I approach it? What's going on with that? Let's talk it through, because it's us trying to fix this thing outside of us. The problem, I feel like, when that economy of shame, there is a moral high ground that I'm expected to step into as the person of color. And that doesn't feel like we are partners, that we're on the same team, because now the white person is looking at me to be like, okay, I need you to fix it. I need you to validate me. And like, everything you say is right and everything that I say is wrong. Oh my gosh. And I'm like, I don't need that. What I need is for you to say, like, I'm bringing something to this conversation. You're bringing something to this conversation. And we're looking at all of the like elements, all the systems that are broken because of white supremacy. And we're saying, okay, do you see this thing over here? This is broken. This is why this thing is broken. And I feel like there's a little bit more trust that I've noticed, more trust and more conversations. And I've heard some really like, I've heard people say things that I don't think they would ever say to another Black person, but because they felt okay with like saying that to me, I've been able to kind of say, okay, well, let's talk about that. Like the thing you just said, like not great, but they know that I'm not going to come like beat them up and say, oh my gosh, you did something totally wrong, I'll never talk to you again, like we burnt a bridge. Because I'm like, okay, I really do just want to be your encourager in this work. And so I think that and I want to be really clear, like I know that this is a particular posture and calling that I have. There are some anti-racist educators for whom the posture of I am giving you a great lesson, I am giving you a great book, I'm covering all the bases, now you need to go sit alone with God and figure it out, or you need to build relationships with other people of color and figure it out. Like, and for that is their gifting and that is their calling, and they're really great at that. For me, as a peacemaker with my gifting and my calling, like I have found that the posture, the you and I are on the same team and we're looking at all the systems together, that has been more effective, and it's helped me hold on to a tenderness and a compassion, and really feel like I'm practicing peace as opposed to creating more division. And that for me, when I feel out of whack, I can't be helpful to another white person, or to a white person.
Let me ask this, because I feel like I know that like in my relationship with John, I think we've been able to watch each other's journey with regard to excavating whiteness, and like the place that we're at in the journey. We've recognized that maybe 10 years ago, the invitation to say follow leaders of color, much less even be mentored by people of color, sounded like a great idea. But say 10 years ago, we might have been struggling to even figure out, how do you navigate into relationship with a person of color, right? Mm-hmm. Then it's, once you're there, you begin to recognize, oh, I actually have to substantively become a different kind of person in order to follow the leadership of a person of color. And as you begin to move into that space, you recognize, oh, like Osheta, you know more about whiteness than I do, because your survival has actually depended on you becoming fluent in whiteness. Mm-hmm. What I watch happening is that oftentimes the white person gets to the place where they recognize, like, whoa, I have to assume a posture of humility, the likes of which I've never experienced before, mm-hmm. in order to actually begin to see the world like you're inviting me to see it. Mm-hmm. And so can you kind of talk to us a bit around, like, who do we need to become as white folk? Because our learning curve, I think, is a lot steeper with regard to whiteness than yours is. Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit around, like, what do you see as the work that white folk need to do in order to grow in fluency of their whiteness?
Well, I think the first thing that white people need to do is they need to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is the very first thing that I think is the first obstacle that I notice a lot of white people go through, is that discomfort. If you don't allow yourself to feel that discomfort and to talk through that discomfort and to get on the other side of it, then you will always stop. And so maybe you'll just read one book, and that book felt really, really uncomfortable for you, and you don't ever want to read another book, or you don't ever want to watch another documentary, or you said something in a meeting and somebody critiqued you, and now you're like, I don't ever want to do that again. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I am so frustrated with seeing so many people who are willing to like go to CrossFit, but they're not willing to do the hard work of like being uncomfortable to talk about race and understanding their social location. Mm. And so I think the very first thing is like, okay, this is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And I think being okay with that, I mean, that is cross-shaped love. That is cruciform love. Like the love of Jesus was on the cross, made himself uncomfortable for us. And so being a white person, doing this work, you just got to know that it's going to be hard. And I think that's why that belovedness piece is so incredibly important, because if you know that no matter what, you are completely loved by God, and that this isn't a referendum on your goodness or your value or your worth, but you are stepping into this hard thing, I think that is incredibly important. And also to like having having a view of like, what are you for? I think too often when we talk about race and racism, it's anti this, it's anti that. But what are we for? What are we working towards? And that's where that organizing piece comes in. That's where being in relationships with people of color and asking them, like, what would restoration around the school system look like so that another brown kid is never called the N-word again? Like having something that you're working for will help you contend with that discomfort, because you go to CrossFit because I guess you want to be lean or pick up tires or something. Like there's something on the other end of that for you. So I think it's important for white people to identify, like, what are we doing this for? What's our vision on the other end of that? And then the other thing, I think fundamentally white people have to step out of an individualist view of themselves, individualism, and recognize that going back to that system thing. Like, you may be a white person who may have never thought never thought a racist thought. You don't have a racist bone in your body. You dated somebody black, like whatever. Like, you may be that kind of person, and that's great. And I'm happy that you have never experienced, you've never been taught racism on an individual personal level. But white supremacy and racism really flourishes in systems. It's systems that give individuals permission to execute racism in their contexts. And so having a view of, just because my personal posture isn't racist, I am influenced by systems that give me permission to benefit off of their racist structures. And so I need to be a person that is always calling out those systems. And then the last thing I would say is that I really wish white people would get super good at lamenting, like really good at learning how to sit with people, sit through grief and grieve alongside their Black brothers and sisters. I cannot tell you, like literally this morning, I have had 2 or 3 conversations with white people who were like, yeah, like the FBI is going to investigate and we'll really find out what happened. There's a video. Like, or he was doing something. Like, the criminalization of Black people in these instances is really hurtful, and it deepens that chasm. And so one of the very best, like, practical things that a white person can do when something like this happens is have a lamenting prayer in your back pocket. Like, get really well versed on the language of lament and grief, and show up in that space of saying, like, I am sharing the suffering of the Black community right now, and this is wrong, and they are mourning. Right now, it's not the time for us to talk about all the details. I'm not going to post a whole bunch of like conspiracy theories, like what about ism? No, like, this is a space where we recognize that the image of God has been violated, and a community no longer feels safe, and I'm going to hold space to grieve and lament, because that is one of the things that I look for when I look for a white person who is doing the work. I'm looking for, are they somebody that is willing to sit with this grief? Because this is an ongoing grieving process. Contending with race and dismantling white supremacy is an ongoing grieving process, because the thing that we wish was there, that essential is goodness of unity between us, it's broken. There's a huge chasm. And so we're always going to be grieving together. And so I really want to see white people step into that space and do some prophetic lamenting, so that we can build trust, and so that we can begin to dismantle those systems together.
Osheta, I'm hearing you invite us into like this formational path towards wholeness, towards peace, requires we actually embrace discomfort, we pursue interdependence, we practice lament. Something that really stands out to me as I hear you say those things is a lot of us have the ability to remain insulated from those practices because of our privilege. And I know even the word privilege can be a triggering word for folks that have it, because it feels like the shame economy again. But, we define privilege as simply the ability to walk away. Many of us have the ability to walk away from the news of another Black man killed by a white cop, because it's not our reality. I can just go on with my day, or walk away from our neighbor's reality who's been deported and how their family survived. It's just coming to terms with this social location you invite us into. So it doesn't need to be a threat. It just needs to be an acknowledgement. And I just want to stay, as we're listening in on this, especially as white folks, if we don't confront that privilege, we miss the opportunity of formation through discomfort, through interdependence, and through lament. We cannot practice those if we just remain in our silos, acting as if our comfort is our priority. And that's not ultimately the path of Jesus, who lived this cruciform way of life, right? That moved through a cross, not around it. And so something that's popping up in the Q&A quite a bit is folks asking about the term whiteness, that maybe that's an obstacle. Using that word is actually an obstacle towards seeing the transformation of those that are still on that journey. How would you interact with, are you seeing those questions, or do you need me to frame it up a bit more?
No, I saw the questions.
Okay.
So I think I think one of the things that we have to do, white people, I think what a knee-jerk reaction is to be like, oh, let's find another word for it. Let's find a different way to describe it, because that word feels really uncomfortable to us. And what I want to say is, I think it's really important for us to honor the work that sociologists have done, that anti-racists have done, and have said, like, this is the best way to describe this current reality. And whether or not that word feels weird for us, I think that's just something we have to contend with. And when I say whiteness and when I say white, what I'm talking about is somebody who, kind of like what Andre said last time, that kind of like Black is the baseline. Like Black is the thing that any other person, or any like person of color or white people, they're contending against. So Black is the bad thing that that white supremacy is heaping on. And so even if somebody is not white, or they're white, or maybe they're like light skinned and they're white passing, like my mom has passed, but she was very light skinned and she had red hair and green eyes, and she was mistaken for white all the time. So she had a privilege of kind of moving through the world and nobody knew that she was a Black woman. And so when I'm talking about white, and when I say whiteness, I recognize that there's a huge spectrum there. And I'm saying, if you have any sort of what's called skin privilege, if you don't look Black, then you're invited into this work of like being a white peacemaker. But white is kind of like that top word, or that top identity that Andre was talking about. So white, and then there's different shades of in between. But Black is always, as a Black person, I will always catch the brunt of any kind of systemic brokenness and any kind of violence, racial violence. I will catch it as a Black person. And maybe not so much my mom. My mom probably wouldn't have had the same experience walking in a store that I will, because I'm very noticeably Black. So that's what I mean by that. But I think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that people have done their work, and then take those words and then figure out a way for it to work it into our peacemaking practice, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. There's another question here from Joel Furrow. It seems like Joe is an executive director of a nonprofit made up of exclusively white folks serving a non-white population. Questions, and he feels like it's promoting kind of the white saviorism, the charity mindset of doing good. How do I start to change our culture while being non-diverse? And then the second question, how do we create a welcoming space for people of color to rise up to leadership? How would you engage with even the way the questions are asked, much less the content of them?
Ask me the questions again, just so I can make sure I'm really.
So all white staff serving a non-white community.
Mm-hmm.
How do I change the culture of our organization, probably away from white saviorism or from a charity space, maybe more to a solidarity space?
Yeah.
And then second question, how do we create a welcoming space for people of color to rise up to leadership? So I think, again, that's a cultural question. Okay.
So, yeah, I wanted to make sure I was answering that right. Okay. So right now I serve on a pastoral team, and I'm one of two brown women. The other woman is biracial. And then it's mostly a white team. There's about 11 of us. And so one of the things that I think is really crucial for changing the culture is inviting brown and Black people into spaces of leadership, into spaces to do workshops, like really deferring to leadership. And I'm saying not just read a book together, because you can read a book together as a white staff, and then you are going to you're going to process that within your white framework. And so you will not have the perspective, like you have the words of the author, but you won't actually have the author or a person of color there to kind of bounce back and forth. And so if you're going to read a book by a person of color, which is one of the things that I say when people read my book, like if you're going to read my book, I will show up and do a book club for you for like in real time for free, because I really think it's important to actually have a person of color there to speak into how you're processing that. And then I also think that it's important, if you want to build a culture that is welcoming to Black leaders, then you actually have to listen to Black leaders. Like if they come in and say, this is not great, like you guys are singing the song, but you're not really living out this diversity or this multicultural ethos, or you're throwing this kind of party, or you're saying these kind of things in your meeting, or like if a person of color says you need to change this, then if you want to create a welcoming environment, then you have to listen to them, and you have to say, okay, I don't know what I don't know, and do that work. And then if you invite a person of color onto your staff, and I'm really blessed that I'm on a staff like this, that when I speak up, the other white pastors listen. They respect my thoughts. They may disagree with my thoughts, like they may pull me aside and say, help me understand this more, but they don't tell me in a meeting context like, oh, I think you're wrong, or I disagree, or well, what about this? Like I'm an honored and listened to member in that leadership structure. And so I think one of the dangers of inviting a Black person into a mostly white staff, when you haven't had a conversation with the other white people on that staff, that like we are going to fundamentally change maybe even the way that we do meetings to create space that we listen to each other, and we also listen to our new person of color leader, Black leader on staff. Like when you do that and a person of color steps on the staff, I'm just going to keep saying Black from now on. When a Black person steps on staff and then they are respected and then they are heard and their input is actually implemented in your system, that's how you begin to build a culture. Because oftentimes a Black person can be brought onto staff and then they can just, their words and their input will never be, it's never listened to. They become what's called a token. And then so you look really great, like you as the white leaders look really great because now you've created a page on your website that doesn't look like a whole bunch of white people, but you still have a culture of white supremacy because you didn't give space to that Black leader. So that's what I would say is, those are the two kind of things, like listen to Black leaders and actually implement their advice in your structure and your organizations.
And yes, those of you listening, take her up on that offer. Hear really well when you do, and that book's coming too, so get ready. Hey, here's another one, and I think it's really good because I think something that is that we've mentioned a couple times, and it's you especially from you saying it's a choice you've made to walk with white folks down this journey, and it's not a journey you have to take with us, but you're choosing to. So the question from Lance is, how do we not take this generosity and then weaponize it towards other leaders of color who don't feel compelled or shouldn't feel the need to walk with us on this journey for so many reasons. So how do we celebrate the generosity and not weaponize those that are in a different space?
Well, I think you, so I think what it's almost, okay, have you ever seen like a rom-com where like everything goes wrong simply because they're just not having a conversation? Like if you would just like say the thing that's going on between you two, like the movie would be like 30 minutes long. It would not, like all of the things that happen. And so what I feel like is, if you are learning from a Black leader and you're curious about, like, you want to go a little bit deeper, I think it's totally, completely okay to kind of message them and say, I'm having all these feelings, I'm processing this. Do you have space to talk to me more about it? And I really appreciate when white people come to me and say, like, I know you don't have to do this, but if you have time, like, I appreciate that. I'm happy to take the time, but I think by and large, just going to that leader, that Black leader, and say like, hey, I would love to spend more time talking to you about this. And if they say like, no, I don't I don't have time for that, or I don't want to do that. Just respect them and not say like, oh, but you know, there's this leader over here that has this posture. And because I think, like I said, we need both approaches. Like I know I'm not the only Black leader that has this posture. I mean, I think of John Perkins, one of the co-founders of CCDA. Like he had very much had a posture like this. And there are other leaders who choose to do this work of coming alongside white people, and neither one is better or worse. And so I think that just the way that you don't weaponize it is just don't say like, oh, but hey, there's somebody else over here that should be doing this. Go to that leader. Like if you know they're doing that, like come to me or come to another leader that's like making space to have those kind of conversations. And then also I think the other thing too is be really careful what you're processing with a Black leader, because 9 times out of 10, the emotions that you're processing would probably be best to process with another white person who's on this journey. So I have white people in my life who they kind of do their emotional work apart from me. And then they come to me and say, okay, now that I've worked through my emotions around this issue, I really have some other questions so that I can figure out how to do this better. And that is a gift to me, and that is a gift to every Black leader, honestly, because sometimes we are working through our own emotions. The fact that you're going to come and talk to us about race, that's an emotion. We have to work through that emotion. So if you have people like you and John, like John and Jair, like you guys, like work through, like I feel shame, I feel guilt, I feel anger, like work through that with each other. And then if you want to go deeper, go to that person of color. And I think that's another way to prevent weaponizing it, because I think really that urge to weaponize it, or that like desire of like, hey, like, but give me more, is really like you have an emotional need that you need met, and you're asking the Black person to meet that for you. And that's only something that maybe you should do with God, and you should do with another white person for whom they don't have the same emotional baggage with that.
Thanks, Osheta. Let me squeak in one more question here before we head out. You brought up a concept a little bit ago that I think is really important, and I want you to weigh a bit more on. It's this idea of shame resilience, and white people growing their resilience, not just for discomfort, but for shame, like the shame of and the guilt and all those things. Talk to us, if you would, just briefly about what you mean by that, and how would you exhort us to grow in our resilience with regard to shame?
Yeah. So when I say shame resilience, that's not with me. I know Brene Brown uses that often, and she picked it up in her work, in her research. And so when I say shame resilience around this issue right here, the very first thing is I need you to not feel bad about being white. Like I really need for you to not feel bad about that. And because in my work, I have found that I have had to do a whole lot of unpacking of that. Like, okay, you're not bad because you're white, just like I'm not bad because I'm Black. And kind of so that's probably the first thing of building a shame resilience. And then the other thing is that just because you did something bad or you said something wrong, we're all going to say we're going to say wrong things. I'm pretty sure I maybe said something that has offended somebody or rubbed somebody the wrong way. Like we're all going to make mistakes on this journey. The trust that we build with each other is our willingness to be vulnerable and making those mistakes with each other, and then saying, okay, what did we learn from that? Kind of like the 4 questions that you asked. What did you hear? Like, what did we learn from that? And what are we going to do next? And knowing that that's your process, that you're going to say, okay, I totally used the wrong word, or I totally shared the wrong information about this shooting or whatever. Okay, well, I made a mistake and I'm going to move forward. There's one pastor in this area who posted something and it was not helpful at all. And it caused a whole lot of conflict in her comment section. She came to me and 4 other Black leaders and said, can you read this response that I'm going to write in response to the thing that I did? That is shame, resilience, and action. Yeah. She was like, you know what? I'm going to go back to the white people that are following me and say, I did this thing wrong, but hey, like, here is what I'm learning and here's what I'm doing and here's where I'm going next with it, so that I don't do the wrong thing again. And just be really transparent. And I think that for me, is what shame resilience looks like. It's just, this is going to be hard, but you're going to just walk through the hardness and not beat up on yourself in the process.
Thanks. Awesome.
Well, this has been a humongous gift. We are deeply grateful. For those of you all listening in, please give outpouring of gratitude to Osheta in the form of comments on here, but also in the form of following and supporting her work as much as you possibly can. Again, Dear White Peacemakers podcast and book that's coming. Instagram is a great way to connect with her work and to support it through Patreon. So it sounds like early 2020 is when the book's going to happen. Is that right?
Early
2021.
2021.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I was like, what day is it? That's like COVID-19
COVID
reality.
brain.
Exactly.
Early next year. So please support her work. We're going to have a ways to support in the follow-up email with links and all that kind of thing. Ways that we can support you right now. We've just launched a initiative we're calling Walk and Talks, where we're just opening up the phone line with our team to walk with you through these hard conversations. And we want to be an open ear. We don't promise all the answers, but we'll ask reflective questions. We'll listen and we'll offer coaching where we can. You can sign up for those. That'll be in the follow-up email. Go back, listen to the recording of Andre Henry's webinar from a couple weeks ago and some of those next steps. It's a great pathway for our next steps collectively as White Peacemakers answering this call. And I want to thank our Embers community, which is our community of monthly funders who support this work of global immersion and the training of everyday peacemakers. We are leaning on you. If you want to join that community with a monthly contribution, we'd be deeply grateful so we can produce more of these resources for free to all of you listening in. So our prayer and our hope is that we can walk this journey together towards a table that looks like a restored reality that we trust that God is making, to be part of a beloved community that is free of shame and liberates us towards wholeness. So we pray that for you, and we accompany you in that as we navigate the journey ourselves. Go in peace, friends. Thank you all.
Bye.